London, 1851. St. George Chapel stood resplendent on this crisp May morning, sunlight streaming through stained glass windows, casting jewel tones across rows of English aristocracy dressed in their finest. White roses and lilies adorned every surface, their heady fragrance filling the air as James Blackwood, the 6th Duke of Westmoreland, stood tall and imposing at the altar beside his radiant bride, Lady Catherine Pembroke. At 33, the Duke cut a striking figure in his formal attire, his dark hair brushed back from features that society pages frequently described as noble if severe. Catherine, barely 22, fair-haired and delicate, trembled slightly beside him in her gown of ivory silk and Brussels lace, a vision of youthful beauty that contrasted with the Duke's weathered countenance. The congregation watched with approval as the bishop conducted the ceremony, his sonorous voice echoing through the ancient stones. This match had been deemed most appropriate by society, coming precisely 16 months after the tragic drowning of the Duke's first wife, Alexandra Pembroke, Catherine's elder sister. When the bishop asked if anyone knew just cause why this couple should not be joined, the traditional pause was expected to pass in reverent silence. Instead, the heavy oak doors at the rear of the chapel crashed open, the sound reverberating like thunder through the sacred space. A collective gasp rippled through the assembly as heads turned to witness a figure silhouetted in the doorway, rain-drenched and breathing heavily as though having run a great distance. Water dripped from her cloak onto the marble floor as she moved forward with deliberate steps, her face partially obscured by a veil, yet unmistakable to those who knew her well. The Duke froze, colour draining from his face as recognition dawned in his eyes. Catherine clutched at his arm, her bouquet of white roses falling forgotten to the floor as her legs threatened to give way. The mysterious woman continued her advance down the aisle, the congregation parting before her like the Red Sea. "I believe that position is already filled," she announced, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the now silent chapel, as the Duchess of Westmoreland still lives. Alexandra Pembroke stood before them, not drowned and buried as all had believed for 3 long years, but alive and tangibly present. The multicolored light from the stained glass windows illuminated her face as she removed her veil, revealing features similar to Catherine's, yet marked by hardship and determination rather than youthful softness. Society matrons reached for their smelling salts, gentlemen murmured in shocked disbelief, and the bishop clutched his prayer book to his chest as though it might shield him from this unprecedented scandal. But James and Alexandra saw no one else, locked in a gaze of recognition across 3 years of presumed death, grief, and apparent betrayal. In that frozen moment between heartbeats, the foundations of carefully reconstructed lives crumbled, and the certainties upon which a society marriage had been built vanished like morning mist before the harsh light of an impossible return. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The leaden skies of London wept against the windows of Westmoreland House as Alexandra Pembroke sat straight-backed in a leather chair across from her husband in his mahogany-panelled study, her borrowed dress still damp from the rain that had soaked her during her dramatic entrance at St. George Chapel mere hours ago. At 28, she was no longer the fresh-faced bride of 3 years past, her features now sharpened by experiences that had carved away youthful softness, replaced by a hard-won resilience evident in the set of her jaw and the steady gaze she levelled at the Duke. James Blackwood paced before the hearth, his wedding clothes discarded for a simple shirt and waistcoat, his dark hair dishevelled from repeatedly running his fingers through it, his expression cycling between disbelief, anger, and something more complex that might have been longing. The portrait of Alexandra that still hung above the fireplace seemed to watch the scene unfold with painted eyes that captured none of the newfound hardness in the living woman, a ghost from happier times preserved in oils and gilt. "They found my cloak and blood by the cliffs," she stated, her voice controlled despite the emotion churning beneath, her fingers white where they gripped the armrest. "You held a funeral, mourned me for precisely 14 months before courting my sister. How efficiently you grieved, James." Rain lashed against the windows with renewed vigor, mirroring the turbulence within the room as the Duke stopped his pacing to face her, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. "I buried an empty casket," he responded, his voice hoarse with restraint. "I searched those waters for 2 months, Alexandra. Every fishing boat from Dover to Brighton was enlisted. When the sea refused to give you back, what would you have had me do?" Alexandra turned her gaze to the rain-streaked window, unwilling to let him see how his words affected her, how the image of him searching haunted waters pierced through her carefully constructed armor. "It matters little now," she replied, the practiced composure returning to her voice. "What matters is that I did not drown that day off Blackwood Cliffs as everyone believed. The sailing accident that supposedly claimed her life had been the talk of London society, whispers of tragedy following the Duke for months afterward, speculation about his young wife's competence on the water, despite growing up near the sea. Now those same drawing rooms would buzz with even more scandalous theories, dissecting every detail of her miraculous return and the interrupted wedding to her younger sister." James moved to the sideboard, pouring amber liquid into a crystal tumbler with hands that betrayed the slightest tremor. "You speak of your supposed death and miraculous resurrection as though recounting a mildly interesting dinner party, Alexandra. 3 years. 3 years I believed you dead. And now you return on my wedding day, to my betrothed, your sister. The timing suggests deliberate cruelty." Alexandra raised her chin slightly, meeting his accusation with cool dignity. "The timing was not of my choosing, nor was my absence. But I notice you do not deny the efficiency of your recovery, nor explain why, of all the eligible women in England, you chose Catherine to replace me, 6 months earlier, beneath a canopy of stars and paper lanterns strung through the gardens of Pembroke Estate. James Blackwood stood at the periphery of a summer ball he had reluctantly attended after 2 years of avoiding such frivolities. Lord and Lady Pembroke had been persistent in their invitations, citing family connections that survived even death until propriety demanded his acceptance. The Duke had arrived late, hoping to make a brief appearance before retreating to London, but found himself unexpectedly lingering as he observed Catherine Pembroke across the terrace. No longer the gangly girl who had served as bridesmaid at his wedding, Catherine had blossomed into a poised young woman of 21, her golden hair and blue eyes reminiscent of Alexandra, yet distinctly her own. She moved with practiced grace among the guests, her laugh occasionally carrying across the garden to where he stood, the sound stirring an unwelcome attraction that brought with it immediate guilt. Each time their eyes met across the gathering, Catherine blushed prettily, a response that betrayed the childhood infatuation she had harbored for her sister's husband, now transformed into womanly interest that Lady Pembroke was all too eager to encourage. "Alexandra would want you to find happiness again." "Your Grace," Lady Pembroke insisted, as she guided him through the rose garden, conveniently encountering Catherine examining a particularly fine bloom. "And who better to understand your loss than family who shared it?" The orchestration was transparent yet effective, for Catherine possessed a gentleness that soothed his wounded spirit. Her conversation peppered with careful references to Alexandra that acknowledged her absence without dwelling in melancholy. Throughout the evening, Alexandra hovered like a ghost between them, her name a whisper in their careful conversations, her memory simultaneously binding them together and standing between them. By the time the orchestra played the final waltz, James found himself requesting Catherine's hand, leading her onto the lantern-lit terrace where other couples danced beneath the summer sky. Pembroke watched from the edge of the terrace, satisfaction evident in her shrewd gaze as she observed her careful maneuvering bear fruit. In the weeks that followed, James called upon Catherine with increasing frequency, their shared connection to Alexandra creating a foundation of understanding that gradually evolved into genuine affection. She never pressured him to forget, instead creating space for his grief while gently encouraging him toward life again, a skill that made her seem wise beyond her years. In her, James found a balm for his solitude, a connection to the happiness he had once known, and by autumn, society whispered of an imminent engagement. When he finally proposed beneath the maple trees of Hyde Park, their leaves turned golden like Catherine's hair, she accepted with tears that spoke of both joy and lingering sorrow for her sister, whose approval they both silently sought, even as they pledged themselves to one another, unaware that across an ocean Alexandra fought daily to return to the life they were reimagining without her. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, its solemn chimes echoing through Westmoreland House as Alexandra stood in the doorway of what had once been her bedchamber, now occupied by Catherine. Moonlight spilled through parted curtains, illuminating her younger sister, who sat perched at the edge of the bed, still wearing her wedding gown, golden hair unpinned and falling around shoulders that trembled with silent sobs. Alexandra entered without invitation, her gaze sweeping over the room where echoes of her former life remained oddly intermingled with Catherine's possessions. Her own silver hairbrush still occupied the vanity beside Catherine's perfume bottles, her favorite shawl draped over a chair, her watercolors hanging beside new landscapes in Catherine's softer style, a visual representation of how thoroughly yet incompletely she had been replaced. Catherine looked up, her tear-stained face a portrait of guilt and fear as she rose unsteadily to her feet, hands clutched before her like a penitent at prayer. "Alexandra," she whispered, the single word carrying questions she dared not articulate. Alexandra closed the door behind her with deliberate care, her movements controlled though rage and betrayal coursed beneath her composed exterior. "I survived pirates, fever, and 2 years on a remote island waiting for a rescue that never came, only to find my husband in my sister's arms and my mother orchestrating the match," she stated, her voice quiet yet cutting as she moved deeper into the room, fingertips trailing across the familiar furnishings now claimed by another. Catherine flinched as though physically struck, backing away until her legs met the edge of the bed that had once been Alexandra's marital bed. "I thought you dead," she protested weakly. "We all did." The cloak, the blood on the rocks. James was inconsolable for months. Alexandra gave a bitter laugh, lifting a small porcelain figurine from the mantelpiece, a dancer she had purchased in Paris during her honeymoon. "The blood was mine," she acknowledged, studying the delicate figurine before returning it to its place. "I was attacked at the cliffs by men seeking ransom, though they got more than they bargained for when their ship was intercepted by colonial authorities near Madagascar. Unfortunately, I was presumed part of their crew rather than a captive, and spent months proving my identity before securing passage on a merchant vessel, only to be shipwrecked and washed ashore on an uncharted island." Every word struck Catherine like a physical blow, her imagined rivalry with a ghost transforming horrifically into the knowledge that while she had been gradually inserting herself into Alexandra's life, her sister had been fighting for survival against impossible odds. "How convenient for everyone that I was declared dead rather than missing," Alexandra continued, her tone conversational, though her eyes burned with cold fury. How fortunate that my death freed James to seek comfort in familiar arms, and how very efficient of Mother to ensure those arms belonged to you. 3 days after Alexandra Pembroke had risen from the presumed dead to halt a wedding, her name dominated every conversation in London drawing-rooms, gentlemen's clubs, and servants' quarters alike. Morning papers lay spread across the mahogany desk in the Duke of Westmoreland's study, their bold headlines proclaiming variations of the scandal with increasingly embellished accounts, some suggesting Alexandra had hidden in England all along, others claiming she had been held captive by Mediterranean pirates demanding ransom the Duke had refused to pay. James Blackwood stood by the window, watching rain continue its relentless assault on London, as though the heavens themselves passed judgment on his predicament, his face haggard from sleepless nights spent pacing these same floors. Lord Hartwick, his oldest friend since Eton days, occupied the leather chair opposite the desk, his expression grave as he surveyed the newspapers and the untouched breakfast tray beside them. The past 72 hours had transformed Westmoreland House into both fortress and prison, with servants instructed to turn away the stream of callers bearing thinly veiled curiosity disguised as concern. While inside, 3 people avoided one another with careful precision. Catherine sequestered in the East Wing, Alexandra installed in guest quarters, and James trapped between duty and desire with no clear path forward. Legally, Alexandra remains your wife, Hartwick stated, setting aside the morning paper with a grimace of distaste for its lurid speculation. The question is whether your heart has truly transferred its allegiance. James ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his wedding ring, never removed during the 3 years of presumed widowhood, catching momentarily in the dark strands. Society expects me to welcome Alexandra back without hesitation, he responded, his voice rough from too much whiskey and too little sleep. After all, I mourned her publicly, spoke of irreplaceable loss, and wore black for a full year. How eager they are to cast Catherine as the scheming sister rather than acknowledge the impossible position we all find ourselves in. Lord Hartwick rose, crossing to the sideboard to pour 2 glasses of brandy despite the early hour, handing one to his friend with the ease of long familiarity. Lady Jersey has already withdrawn her invitation to the Pembroke family for her ball next week, he noted, while Lady Catherine is being painted as either victim or villain, depending on which drawing room one frequents. Your reputation hangs similarly in the balance, contingent upon your next actions. The Duke accepted the brandy but did not drink. Instead, watching amber liquid catch morning light as though it might contain answers to the questions tormenting him. He had loved Alexandra once, with the passionate intensity of youth, though that love had cooled considerably before her disappearance. Catherine had reawakened feelings he thought permanently extinguished, her gentle nature healing wounds he had carried for years. Now, duty and honor demanded he recommit to a wife he had buried in his heart, while his awakened heart pulled him toward a future suddenly transformed into impossibility. Dawn painted the eastern sky in delicate hues of pink and gold as Alexandra walked the winding paths of Westmoreland Estate's rose garden, dew dampening the hem of her borrowed morning dress. The garden had once been her pride, each bush planted and tended by her own gloved hands during those first years of marriage, when she had thrown herself into becoming the perfect duchess. Now unfamiliar varieties bloomed where her beloved damask roses had stood, borders rearranged in Catherine's preferred symmetrical patterns, stone benches repositioned to catch different angles of sunlight. Alexandra trailed her fingers across a white rose, noting the thorns had been meticulously pruned away, a detail that struck her as oddly symbolic of how Catherine had smoothed the rough edges from the life Alexandra had left behind. The soft crunch of gravel announced another presence, and she turned to find James standing at the garden entrance, dressed for riding, though the hour was unusually early for him, suggesting he too had found sleep elusive. For a moment neither spoke, the rising sun casting long shadows between them as birds began their morning chorus from nearby elms. "You were never awake at this hour before," he observed finally. His voice carefully neutral, though his eyes tracked her movements with wariness that bordered on fascination. "I rarely slept past dawn on the island," she replied, continuing her circuit of the garden, noting changes with each step. "When survival depends upon gathering food before the day's heat becomes unbearable, one adapts quickly to new patterns." James fell into step beside her, close enough to converse yet maintaining a careful distance that acknowledged the chasm between them. "You speak of your ordeal with remarkable composure," he noted, studying her profile as though searching for the woman he had married in this stranger who wore her face. "The Alexandra I knew would have collapsed under such hardships. I am not the obedient, naive girl you married, James," she responded, stopping beside a marble fountain Catherine had commissioned to replace Alexandra's preferred wildflower meadow. That Alexandra drowned in the channel, even if her body did not. A silence stretched between them, filled with the fountain's gentle splashing and memories of who they had once been to each other. James watched as she unconsciously straightened her shoulders and raised her chin, physical manifestations of an inner steel forged through circumstances he could scarcely imagine. He recognized little of the sheltered society wife who had once sought his approval for every decision, from menu selections to gown choices. This woman before him carried herself with the confidence of one who had faced the worst life could offer and emerged victorious. "The garden paths you added in the west corner follow no logical pattern," he remarked. "The mundane observation, an obvious retreat from more dangerous emotional territory." "They follow the constellations I used to navigate by," Alexandra corrected him. A ghost of their former intimacy surfacing briefly as she added, "Some changes are improvements, James, not merely differences to be mourned." Restlessness drove James from his bed well past midnight, the echoes of conversations with Alexandra and Lord Hartwick haunting him in equal measure. Seeking distraction, he found himself in his private study adjacent to his bedchamber, a sanctuary few were permitted to enter. A fire burned low in the grate, casting long shadows across the room as he methodically sorted through correspondence that had accumulated during wedding preparations. Beneath a stack of legal documents lay a small brass key he did not immediately recognize, though something about its ornate design tugged at his memory. Turning it thoughtfully between his fingers, realization dawned that this was the key to Alexandra's writing desk, a delicate rosewood piece that had been moved to storage after her presumed death, deemed too painful a reminder to remain in daily view. Driven by an impulse he could not name, James retrieved the desk from an unused chamber where Catherine had relegated it, returning to his rooms where firelight caught the rich patina of wood polished by Alexandra's hands. The lock turned smoothly despite 3 years of disuse, revealing compartments containing her personal correspondence, visiting cards, and sheets of unused stationery embossed with her initials. Finding nothing of significance, he nearly abandoned his search when his fingers discovered a slight irregularity in the wood grain of the central drawer. Pressing carefully, he triggered a hidden mechanism that revealed a secret compartment containing a leather-bound journal he had never seen before. The first entry was dated shortly after their wedding, the handwriting unmistakably Alexandra's, though more confident than her usual careful script. "My husband sees the Duchess he created, never the woman beneath," he read silently, throat tightening at words penned by a wife he realized he had never truly known. "Perhaps that is why I find myself drawn to the cliffs, where I can finally breathe without society's constraints." Page after page revealed a woman struggling against the confines of her role, an intelligent mind suffocating beneath the weight of societal expectations, and a husband too preoccupied with moulding the perfect duchess to notice the woman fading before him. As the fire died to embers and night gave way to the grey light of approaching dawn, James read of Alexandra's growing desperation, her attempts to engage his interest in her thoughts rather than merely her performance of duties, her loneliness within a marriage that appeared perfect to outside observers, yet left her profoundly isolated. The final entry, dated the very day of her disappearance, contained words that would haunt him for years to come. "James will never see beyond the role he created for me, Alexandra had written, her usually precise penmanship uncharacteristically agitated. "The cliffs call to me more strongly each day, promising a freedom I cannot find in this gilded cage. If something should happen to me, would anyone mourn the woman or merely the Duchess?" The journal slipped from his fingers as the first rays of sunlight breached the horizon, illuminating the face of a man confronting the devastating possibility that his wife's disappearance might not have been entirely accidental, and that the grief he had so efficiently processed had been for a woman who existed primarily in his imagination. Thunder crashed against the windows of Westmoreland House as James found Alexandra in the library, her silhouette outlined against flashes of lightning that momentarily illuminated the room in harsh white light. She stood before the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel beneath the stern portrait of the previous Duke, James's father, whose painted eyes seemed to watch with perpetual disappointment as his son approached with Alexandra's journal clutched in white-knuckled fingers. "I found your writings," he stated without preamble, his voice tight with emotion held too long in check, watching as she turned to face him. Recognition and then resignation crossing her features as she saw what he carried. 3 days of uneasy coexistence had maintained a veneer of civility that now shattered like the lightning splintering the sky outside, leaving them exposed to truths both had avoided. "Did you fall or jump that day, Alexandra?" he asked, the question hanging between them like the suspended moment between lightning and thunder, raw and terrible in its implications. "Does it matter?" She countered, her voice stripped of its careful composure. "You seemed relieved to be free of a wife who failed to give you an heir and asked too many questions." James flinched as though struck, rain lashing against the windows, matching the storm of emotions crossing his features, the careful mask of ducal authority washing away to reveal the man beneath. "I mourned you," he insisted, advancing until mere feet separated them, the heat of the fire warming one side while the chill of truth frosted the other. "Did you mourn the woman or the Duchess?" Alexandra challenged, her eyes reflecting firelight and unshed tears as she gestured toward the journal. "You never knew me, James. Never saw beyond the role you created. I tried to be what you wanted, what your father told you a duchess should be, until I could no longer recognize myself when I looked in the mirror." The portrait above them seemed to loom larger in the firelight, the previous Duke's disapproving gaze a palpable weight in the room where his son now confronted truths he had spent 3 years avoiding. "I was drowning in our marriage long before I disappeared," Alexandra continued, her voice breaking on the admission, the composure of recent days giving way to honesty, forged in isolation and survival. "When those men attacked me at the cliffs, part of me welcomed the chaos, welcomed any change from the suffocating perfection you demanded. What neither of them acknowledged aloud, but both understood in that moment of brutal clarity, was the essential question lurking beneath their confrontation. Not whether Alexandra had intended to end her life that day on the cliffs, but whether either of them truly wished to reclaim a marriage that had been more performance than partnership, more duty than love, a gilded cage that had trapped them both in roles neither had chosen for themselves, but neither had been brave enough to reject. 3 weeks after Alexandra Pembroke returned from the dead, the drawing-room of Westmoreland House bore witness to an unprecedented gathering as James stood before the marble fireplace, his solicitor seated at a small writing desk nearby, with documents arrayed before him. Portraits of previous Westmoreland dukes lined the walls like silent judges, their stern faces watching as both Pembroke sisters entered at the appointed hour. Catherine pale and resigned in a gown of dove grey that matched the London sky outside, Alexandra composed in deep blue silk that emphasized the determined set of her shoulders. Neither sister acknowledged the other as they took seats on opposite sides of the room, the distance between them measuring more than mere physical space as the solicitor cleared his throat uncomfortably in the charged silence. James had spent these 3 weeks in deep reflection, consulting legal experts about the unprecedented situation while avoiding society entirely, his absence from clubs and drawing rooms fueling speculation that grew wilder with each passing day. "I have asked you here to share my decision regarding our unusual circumstances," he began, his gaze moving between the two women who had, each in their way, shaped his understanding of himself. "I married a woman I barely knew and grieved a wife I never truly understood," he continued, his voice steady, though emotion underscored each word. "I cannot make the same mistake twice." Catherine stared fixedly at her clasped hands, tears gathering but not falling, a picture of quiet dignity in what she clearly anticipated as her final moments as almost Duchess. Alexandra watched James with the wary assessment of one who had survived impossible odds and would do so again, regardless of his decision, her expression betraying nothing of her thoughts. "After consulting extensively with my solicitor, I have determined the most honourable course," James stated, nodding to the older man who pushed forward documents requiring signatures. "Our marriage was based on mutual misunderstanding and unfulfilled expectations, Alexandra. While legally binding, it was never the partnership either of us deserved. I am providing settlement that ensures your complete financial independence for life, an arrangement my solicitor assures me is unprecedented in its generosity. As for us, Catherine," he continued, turning to the younger sister whose eyes now lifted to meet his, "we built our connection on shared grief for a woman who lived. Whatever genuine affection grew between us, it sprouted from false soil. I cannot in good conscience proceed with marriage when that foundation has been so thoroughly undermined." Both sisters stared at James with matching expressions of shock as understanding dawned that he was choosing neither, but rather freeing all three from the tangled web of obligation, expectation, and misunderstanding that had bound them together. The solicitor discreetly busied himself with papers, avoiding the intensity of emotions filling the room as James Blackwood, 6th Duke of Westmoreland, finally stepped away from the roles his father had demanded and society had expected, choosing instead the more difficult path of honesty and self-determination. Mediterranean sun gilded the waves as Alexandra Pembroke stood at the bow of the merchant vessel Minerva, her passage to Florence paid from the substantial settlement that now ensured her independence. 1 year had passed since her dramatic return had upended 3 lives and scandalized London society, a year of legal negotiations, whispered speculation, and ultimately, freedom. The spring breeze carried salt and promise as it lifted tendrils of her hair, now styled simply without the elaborate arrangements expected of an English duchess. Around her throat gleamed her mother's sapphires, part of the settlement James had insisted she accept, their weight a reminder of chains broken rather than bonds maintained. In her hands she held his latest letter, the paper crisp against her fingers as she reread words that confirmed the final severing of their connection. "The annulment is finalized," he had written in his decisive hand. "Westmoreland has provided your settlement as promised. Catherine has returned to the countryside. I find myself unexpectedly grateful for your return, not to resume our marriage, but to finally end it honestly. The letter contained no recriminations, no blame for the scandal that had seen him withdraw temporarily from society, just as it held no romantic declarations or regrets for paths not taken. Like Alexandra herself, James had emerged from their shared ordeal with clearer understanding of his own needs and desires, choosing solitary reflection over hasty attachments. Society had eventually found new scandals to occupy their interest, though Alexandra occasionally received correspondence from former acquaintances expressing curiosity about her new life. Their letters thinly veiled attempts to gather gossip rather than genuine concern for her welfare. Such letters remained unanswered as she focused instead on the future she now claimed for herself, funded by the settlement that transformed her from dependent wife to woman of independent means. The captain approached, informing her they would dock in Livorno by nightfall, his manner respectful without the excessive deference once accorded her due to title. Alexandra expressed her thanks with the easy confidence of a woman who had negotiated her own passage and planned her own journey, no male relatives required to smooth her way or approve her decisions. In her trunk below deck lay journals filled with observations and sketches from her time on the island, material for the book she planned to write, adding her voice to the small but growing number of women. Travel writers documenting worlds beyond English drawing rooms. As Italy rose on the horizon, its coastline golden in afternoon light, Alexandra closed James's letter and tucked it into her pocket, a final chapter in a story that had shaped but would no longer define her. The woman who had once drowned beneath the weight of a duchess's coronet now stood tall, face turned toward new horizons, breathing deeply of the freedom she had won through survival, determination, and the courage to claim her own life regardless of society's judgment.